Hi, have you quietly accepted decline? A year ago, my doctor sat me down and told me my cholesterol was high enough that we needed to talk about statins. Now, it wasn't the tablet that got to me, it was the direction of travel. I sat in the car afterwards and thought, one medication becomes two, then three, less movement, more tiredness, more things being managed. Is that just what getting older looks like? So I asked myself a question I'd never seriously asked at 50. Where is the life I'm currently living actually taking me? When I was 50, I didn't spend much time thinking about becoming 70 or 80. Now, I knew I was getting older, obviously. The birthdays kept coming. I was watching my children turn into the accomplished young adults, and I was feeling definitely more aches and pains every day than I used to. But 70 still felt a long, long way away, and 80 felt almost theoretical. Now, I wasn't asking what kind of shape I wanted to be in by 70. I wasn't imagining whether I'd still be strong, whether I'd be able to move freely, carry my own shopping, travel, play golf, walk up hills, or keep living independently. I was just getting on with life. And most of the choices I was making were probably the same ones I'd been making for the previous 20 or 30 years. I ate in much the same way. I moved when daily life required me to move. I'd occasionally join a gym, get enthusiastic for a few weeks or months, and then quietly stop. I wasn't consciously choosing poor health. I certainly wasn't choosing weakness or dependence or a future full of limitations. I just wasn't thinking seriously about where my choices were actually taking me. And I suspect a lot of people reach their 50s exactly the same way. We know aging is happening, but we don't always connect the ordinary choices we make today with the person we're going to become in 20 years from now. At 50, 70 can feel distant. Then suddenly you're 60, and 70 doesn't feel distant at all anymore. For me, it took a couple of relatively minor health issues to interrupt that pattern. And this is the story behind the moment I opened with. Now, in 2024, I had a hip replacement. The arthritis had been getting worse for years, and I'd resisted the operation for as long as I could. And part of that was probably practical, but honestly, part of it was emotional. Needing a hip replacement felt like a marker. It felt like evidence that I was getting older in a way I wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. And the operation itself was a real success. The pain went, my movement improved, and I'm genuinely grateful for the NHS and what they did for me. But the experience changed how I thought about my body. It made me realize my body had been telling me a story for years and I hadn't really been listening. And then in 2025, I started experiencing breathlessness, not just feeling a bit unfit, the kind of breathlessness that makes a flight of stairs feel, far more demanding than it should. Because there's a history of heart problems in my family, I went to see my doctor. The tests were reassuring, but my cholesterol was high, and my doctor explained my estimated risk of a cardiovascular event over the next 10 years was high enough that we needed to talk about statins. Now, I want to be really clear here. This isn't a video telling you to reject medication, not at all. I'm not a doctor, and medication, obviously essential. I eventually agreed to take the statins, and any decision like that should be made with a qualified medical professional. But that appointment affected me. And like I said at the start, it wasn't really the idea of taking a tablet, it was the direction of travel. And on the drive home, I started thinking about my future in a way I never had at 50. I asked myself a very simple question. Where is the life I'm currently living actually taking me? Not where do I hope it's taking me, not where would I like to end up. Where are my repeated choices, the ones I make on autopilot, actually taking me? And that was uncomfortable because I could see that if I kept making the same choices I'd made for the previous 20 or 30 years, I was probably going to keep getting the same results. Only now, those results would show up in an older body with less room for error and less time to reverse the direction. That's when I realized I had to start making different choices. I needed to eat better. I needed to move more and I needed to rebuild strength. I needed to take sleep and recovery, my long-term health, a lot more seriously. But then came another realization. None of that was new information. I already knew exercise was good for me. I already knew that eating half a tub of ice cream most evenings probably wasn't helping. I already knew I should sleep more, walk regularly, build some muscle. I'd known most of that for years, and I'd also tried before. I joined gyms before. I'd promised myself I'd lose weight before. I'd started eating better before. I'd been on diets. I'd bought the exercise clothes, made the plans, and started each time with real enthusiasm. Now, sometimes it lasted maybe a few weeks, occasionally a few months, and then little by little I drifted back to the old habits. So that became the more interesting question for me. Why? Why, when I know exactly what I need to do I keep defaulting back to the choices that were taking me in the opposite direction? Why could I make a perfectly rational decision on a Sunday evening and abandon it by Wednesday? Why did the old habits feel easier, even when I knew they weren't good for me? Now, for years, I might have answered that by saying I lacked discipline, that I was lazy or inconsistent or just not one of those people who could stick to things. But I don't think that was ever the whole truth. I think what was really happening is that I was trying to build new behavior while staying attached to an old identity. I was trying to force myself to act like a healthier person without yet actually seeing myself as one. And when the motivation faded, as motivation nearly always does, I went straight back to what was familiar. Now that matters. That matters because the familiar has a strange power over us. It doesn't have to be good. It doesn't have to make us happy. It doesn't even have to be safe. And in the long run, it only has to be known. When we repeat a behavior often enough, it starts to become automatic. We eat at a certain time because that's just what we do. We sit down in the evening and reach for the same snack without even thinking about it. We tell ourselves, I'm not a gym person. I'm not a runner. I'm not disciplined, not naturally healthy. And after enough repetition, those ideas stop feeling like habits or even opinions, and they start feeling like identity. They start sounding like truth. And that's what I've come to call the red carpet. Now, the red carpet isn't aging itself. Aging is real. Bodies change, recovery takes longer, illness and injury and genetics might all matter. The red carpet is something different. It's the path of least resistance that quietly invites us to accept more decline than aging alone actually requires. It never pressures you, it's just there, it's waiting. It shows up in the small concessions. You stop walking as far because the shorter route is easier. You stop carrying things because someone else can do it for you. You stop challenging your muscles because you've decided strength training is for younger people. You accept constant tiredness as normal. You tell yourself that getting weaker is just part of getting older. Now, one decision doesn't change your life, but repeated decisions become a direction. And a direction followed for long enough becomes a destination. And that's the thought that really troubled me. I hadn't deliberately chosen decline. I'd simply repeated familiar choices without ever stopping to consider where they'd eventually lead. And here's the breakthrough for me. And I think this is the part most people miss. Information alone was never going to be enough. Most of us already know more than we need to begin. We know vegetables are generally better for us than biscuits. We know walking beats sitting all day, and we know sleep matters. We know strength becomes more important, not less, as we get older. The problem was never that nobody told me what to do. The problem was that knowing hadn't become identity. When I joined gyms in the past, I always felt like someone trying to go to the gym. There was effort wrapped around it. I had to motivate myself, persuade myself, keep restarting from scratch. Then something started to shift, and it didn't come from anywhere I expected. As part of that same journey to better health, there was something else I needed to fix: my sleep. Now, for years, I'd been waking up in the middle of the night and struggling to get back to sleep. And over time, I started noticing why. My nervous system was all over the place. I'd notice a thought, and that thought would turn into a story. And that story would carry an emotion with it, and after enough repetition, those emotions started to become beliefs. And that's when I started practicing meditation, not as some spiritual pursuit, but just as a way to quieten my mind. Except it didn't stay that simple. What started as a way to switch my mind off at night slowly became something else entirely. And from there, it became workshops, books, training courses, eventually a mentor, someone who could actually guide me properly rather than me just picking things up. And then finally, a regular practice, something I did, not something I dipped into now and again. By this point, I'd already made the decision to change how I was living. I was eating better. I was walking more. I was back in the gym, working through the 6 foundational movements properly. The right weights, the right reps, gradually increasing the load. And none of that had anything to do with meditation, as far as I was concerned. But here's what I didn't understand yet, and it's the thing I spend a whole chapter on in the book. I call it the no one feels safe. Every time we repeat a behavior, we're not just forming a habit in some vague, abstract sense. We're strengthening an actual pathway in the brain, a synapse that fires more easily each time we use it, the way a path through long grass becomes easier to walk the more feet that cross it. Your brain files that pathway away into a filing cabinet, and the more familiar something is, the bigger that file gets. And that's true whether behavior serves you or not. The brain doesn't file things as good for me or bad for me, it just files them as known. And that's why the old habits kept winning. They weren't a character flaw, they were simply the strongest, most well-worn pathways in the filing cabinet, the path of least resistance. Now, what meditation actually gave me, without me realizing it at the time, was a gap. That half second of space between a thought showing up and me automatically acting on the pathway it's usually led to. And in that gap, just occasionally, I had the chance to walk a different path instead. The new one I was trying to build with the gym, the food, the walking. Do that enough times and something remarkable happens. The new pathway gets used and strengthens. The old one stops being used and weakens. Not through willpower, gritting its teeth against the old pattern, through simple repetition, going somewhere new instead. It was around 9 or 10 months in that I looked back and I actually saw what had happened. I was sleeping better. The nightly craving for ice cream had simply disappeared. I hadn't even fought it. I hadn't white-knuckled it. It had just stopped being the strongest pathway available. And I'd been going to my local gym regularly, training properly for months without falling off it. And that was unusual for me. In the past, I'd have started enthusiastically and gradually drifted off it. But this time, I just kept going. I hadn't set out to change my identity. I'd set out to sleep better. But somewhere in those 9 or 10 months, the new habits I'd already decided on had become the known pathway. And the old ones had quietly stopped being the default. Meditation hadn't caused that change directly. It had just given me the gap the new pathway needed to take hold. And I realized I was no longer trying to become someone who went to the gym. Going to the gym had started to become part of who I actually was. Because quite literally, the pathway for it was now the strongest one in the filing cabinet. That distinction sounds small. I don't think it is. I think it changes everything. I didn't change because I suddenly became a far more disciplined person. I changed because the known had changed. Willpower still mattered. There were still mornings I'd rather have stayed home, still days I had to make myself go, but willpower wasn't carrying the whole load anymore. It became backup rather than the entire engine. Now, this is the idea at the heart of the book I've been writing, and it's called Step Off the Red Carpet. It isn't a book about pretending we're young. It isn't about denying illness, rejecting medicine, or promising we can control every outcome, because we can't. It's about recognizing that we may have more influence over our future than we've been led to believe. It's about asking whether the choices we're making today are building the body and the life we actually want in 10 or 20 years. And it's about understanding that lasting change probably needs to start somewhere deeper than a meal plan or an exercise program. It needs to start with how we see ourselves. So I want to leave you with one question. What have you quietly started accepting as inevitable that might actually still be changeable? Maybe you've accepted that you'll always feel tired. Maybe you've decided you're just not someone who exercises. Maybe you've stopped doing something you once loved because you don't quite trust your body anymore. Now, maybe you've noticed your world getting a little smaller and told yourself that's just what happens at your age. Now, don't judge yourself for it, just notice it, because awareness is where choice begins. You can't change a direction you haven't recognized yet. And you don't need to transform your whole life today. You just need to stop and ask, where is the life I'm currently living taking me? And is that actually where I want to go? Now, I'd generally like to hear your answer. What's one thing you've been accepting as just aging that you'd like to challenge? Tell me in the comments, and I suspect a lot of other people watching this will recognize themselves in what you write. And then, over the coming weeks, I'm going to dig into these ideas in a lot more detail. Identity, strength, movement, food, meditation, and what it actually means to build a future rather than just drift into one. Because the red carpet will always offer you the familiar path. The only question is whether you're willing to step off it. Have you quietly started accepting decline?